Night falls hard over the Wyoming Territory. Clouds thick enough to swallow the moon whole. Wind with teeth. A single shot cracks the dark. Horses scream against the rails. Bare feet hit cold floorboards. The man is already on the porch, rifle raised, eyes locked on the black beyond the fence line. At the very edge of the porch lamp's reach, a rider sits motionless. No shout, no warning, just the weight of being watched. Behind him, a woman's breath comes sharp and quick. Her hand grips the rail until the knuckles go white. Something in the air has shifted. Something that will not be put back. The rider doesn't move for a long moment. Then the horse turns. Slow, unhurried. The kind of leaving that feels more like a promise than a retreat. The man lowers the rifle, stares into the empty dark, where the rider disappeared, and the night holds its breath, waiting for whatever comes next. Wyoming Territory, 1883. Nathaniel Colburn did not own much. A cabin. One room built with his own hands, log by log, the winter he turned 29. A lean-to for the horses. A creek that cut through red clay like it had somewhere better to be. And silence. That more than anything. Silence he had paid for. Silence he had earned the hard way, out past the tree line, out past the years he didn't talk about. He was 36 now. Which didn't sound old, except it felt old. Felt old in the joints. Felt old in the places a man carries things he never puts down. He'd been 16 when he lied about his age and rode east to enlist. Told the recruiting officer he was 18. The officer didn't believe him. Signed him up anyway, because that's what war does. It stops asking questions it doesn't want the answer to. He came home 2 years later. If you could call it home. If you could call what came back a man who'd left as a boy. Nobody in the territory called him by his Christian name much. They called him the one who lived alone past Cedar Draw. The one who didn't smile. The one whose eyes had gone the color of a sky right before a storm decides which way it's going to break. He liked it that way, or told himself he did, because liking it and needing it weren't the same thing. And he knew that. Somewhere under the calluses and the quiet, he knew that. His days ran the same shape, one into the next, and he'd built his whole life around that sameness the way another man might build a life around a family. Up before light, coffee black because sugar was a town luxury, and he rode into town as little as pride allowed. Horses fed, fence checked, supper eaten standing up half the time, because sitting down to an empty table felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. He tried once keeping a dog. It died of old age 2 winters back, and he hadn't replaced it. Told himself he didn't need the company. Told himself that most nights, staring at the low fire until it burned down to nothing, and he had no more excuse left to stay awake. It was a Tuesday in late October, when everything he thought he knew about his own life stopped being true. The aspens along the ridge had turned, gold going to rust. The wind had teeth in it already, the kind that told you winter wasn't coming. Winter was already halfway up the trail. He was mending fence, post by post, hands raw, mind empty the way he liked it, until he wasn't alone anymore. He felt it before he heard it, a shift in the air, a presence where there shouldn't be one. He turned. A woman, walking, no wagon, no horse, just her on foot, coming up the long dirt road, with a shawl pulled, so tight around her shoulders it looked less like clothing, and more like armor. He set the hammer down. She stopped 10 feet off. Didn't come closer. Didn't need to. He knew her, or he knew of her. Rosalind Whitfield. Josiah's girl. Josiah who'd been dead 3 weeks now. Fever took him fast. For days, start to finish. Nathaniel had stood at that grave with his hat in his hands, and said nothing, because words had never once come easy to him, and grief hadn't changed that. She was 24, brown hair pinned back plain, no ribbons, no vanity. Eyes red-rimmed but dry, past crying. Somewhere on the far side of it. Her boots were worn through on the left sole. He noticed that first. A man notices boots. A man who's marched knows what worn through boots mean. She held a folded paper against her chest. Both hands, like it might blow away, like it might be the only solid thing left in the world. Miss Whitfield, he said. Not a question. Just her name, set down careful, the way you'd set down something breakable. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. My father said. She stopped, swallowed, started over. My father said you needed a wife. The wind moved through the aspens. A hawk called somewhere up on the rock. Nathaniel didn't answer right away, because there wasn't a right way to answer that. Because a man doesn't get handed a sentence like that and just reply. Because he was already doing the math in his head, already counting backward, through every kindness Josiah Whitfield had ever shown him, and the number kept getting bigger and he didn't know yet how much bigger it was about to get. So he said the only thing that felt true. Maybe. You. Her head came up fast, shawl slipping, eyes wide, and underneath the wide something else. Something she hadn't let herself feel in weeks, by the look of it. Hope. Ugly, unwanted, uninvited hope. She hadn't come for that answer. He could see it plain. She'd come braced for pity, or refusal, maybe anger if he was the kind of man who got angry at being asked such a thing. Not for 2 words, not for a promise dressed up as nothing at all. You don't understand, she said, and her voice cracked on the word understand, cracked and then hardened right back up, because she wasn't a woman who let a crack stay open long. I don't have anything. Father's debts took the house. I owe 3 months at the boarding house in town. Mrs. Ellery says my trunk goes to the street come Friday. She looked at him dead on then. And there it was, that fierceness. He'd seen it once before, years back, in a man half dead, from an arrow wound, who still argued with the doctor about how many stitches he needed. Josiah's fierceness, passed down whole. I'm not here for charity, she said. I know. Father wrote this before he... Her hand tightened on the paper. He told me to come to you, told me before I understood what he meant by it. She held it out. Nathaniel crossed the distance in 3 strides, took it careful like it weighed more than paper should. The handwriting was Josiah's, cramped, deliberate, the same hand that used to write out trail notes in the dark by firelight, notes Nathaniel had once watched him scratch out, with a busted lantern and no complaints. Nathaniel, it read, My Rosalind is too proud to ask for help, and too good to need it. But circumstance has made liars of better people than her. I have told her to go to you. I know what I am asking. I know what you are. Look after her. That is all I ask. That is all I have ever asked. J. W. He read it twice, the second time slower, because the first time through his eyes caught on look after her and stopped, and the second time they caught on the words before it. I know what I am asking, like Josiah knew something Nathaniel himself hadn't fully reckoned with yet. He folded the letter, careful along the same creases Josiah had made, looked out past her at the ridge at a hawk turning slow circles, over the red rock like it had all the time in the world, and nowhere particular to be. Your father pulled me off a trail 7 years back, he said, quiet, not looking at her yet. Arrow through my shoulder. Couldn't ride. He carried me 8 miles in the dark. Sat with me 2 nights after, while the fever tried to take me same as it took him. Never once asked what I owed him for it. Rosalind's lips pressed thin. He never told me that. He wouldn't. That sounds like him. Something moved across her face. Not a smile. Close to one. Gone before it could finish arriving. How long? Nathaniel asked. Before you're out. 4 days. Family in the territory? She shook her head. Just once. Sharp. Then come inside, he said. Wind's picking up. Her chin came up fast, pride flaring like a struck match. I told you, I'm not. I know what you're asking for, he said, even, steady as the fence post still standing between them. And I know what I'm offering. Come inside, Miss Whitfield. We'll talk it through proper. Not out here, where the wind's trying to carry off every word before it lands. She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded, small, final, and followed him in. The cabin was bare in the way a soldier's quarters are bare. A cot, a cast iron stove, one shelf of books, spines cracked from reading, not from show, 2 oil lamps, and neither of them lit yet, because Nathaniel didn't waste kerosene on daylight. He poured coffee into a tin cup, set it in front of her, didn't say anything, while she wrapped both hands around it like it was the first warm thing she'd held in days. Maybe it was. "I'm not offering charity," he said again, because it mattered to him that she heard it twice. "This land's more than one man can work through winter. Gardens failing for lack of hands. I can't keep accounts straight and manage horses and mend what's breaking all at once all season." She didn't answer, just watched the steam curl up off the coffee. "Your father told me once," Nathaniel went on. "Your mother ran a household like a general runs a campaign. Said you learned it from her." Rosalind's eyes lifted, surprised. "He said that. Said you could bake bread in a windstorm. Negotiate a merchant down to nothing, like a circuit judge settling a land dispute." Something cracked open in her face. Small, real. "What exactly are you proposing?" she said. Not quite a question. More like she needed the words said plain, out loud, so she could hold them, and turn them over and decide if they were something she could live inside of. "A legal arrangement," Nathaniel said. "Civil ceremony. Nothing more than that unless we both decide different, further down the road. You'd have your own standing here, your own space, legal right to this property same as mine. In return," he paused, chose the next words like a man choosing where to step on ice. "You help run the house, the accounts, what needs running. People will talk. People always talk. Doesn't change the weather. Doesn't bring in the harvest. And if it doesn't suit either of us, down the road, then it doesn't suit us." He said it plain, no threat in it, no promise either. "A judge that marries 2 people can unmarry them too, given cause. I won't hold you to something that turns out wrong for you. I'd only ask you say so plain, when the time comes, instead of letting it fester quiet. And the household," she said, "how it runs. I won't be told to stay quiet in my own home, whatever the arrangement says on paper. Wasn't planning on it. You say that now. I say it because it's true." He considered a moment, then added, plainer still, "I can't cook worth telling anybody about. Can't keep a house clean past what a man living alone thinks passes for clean. If you're looking for somebody who'll fight you over how things get run in there, you've got the wrong cabin. I'll take whatever order you bring to it, and be grateful." Something almost like humor flickered across her face. "That's either very wise of you or very lazy. Ask me again come spring. I expect it's some of both." She almost smiled at that. Didn't quite let it land, but it was close enough that Nathaniel noticed and found himself oddly wanting to see the rest of it, the whole smile, whenever she finally judged it safe enough to give one. "I'll want my own corner of the garden," she said. "Something that's mine to plant, not just mine to save. Whatever ground you want. And I won't be expected in church every Sunday, if that's a thing you hold to. I don't hold to much of anything on Sundays besides mending what broke during the week." "Good," she said. "Neither do I most weeks. Felt guilty admitting it before now. No guilt required. Not in this cabin." That seemed to land somewhere in her. She studied him a moment longer, like she was checking the offer for a false bottom, and not finding one. She looked at him then, straight on. First time since she'd arrived, that she wasn't looking past him, or around him, or at the floorboards like they held the answer. "Why would you do this?" she said. "You don't know me. I know your father. That's not the same thing." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It isn't." He didn't offer more than that, because he didn't have more than that. Not yet. Not words for it, anyway. Just a feeling sitting low in his chest. Something that had started the second he read Look after her in Josiah's cramped handwriting, and hadn't let go since. She stared at the table a long while. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters, testing them, the way it tested everything, before winter settled in for good. At last she drew a breath. Long, like she was pulling it up from somewhere deep. When? She said. Circuit judge comes through Cedar Draw Thursday morning. Simple as signing a land deed. She looked at him one more time, at his still face, his careful eyes, the way he sat without fidgeting, like a man who'd learned patience the way other men learn a trade, out of necessity and at great cost. She gave a single, slow nod, and that was that. That was how it started. Not with a declaration. Not with anything a person would call romance, not by any measure. Just two people, each carrying a debt to the same dead man, agreeing to carry it together instead of alone. She stayed that first night in the loft space above the stalls, a narrow bunk Nathaniel hauled a spare mattress up to, apologizing for its thinness in a voice that didn't quite know how to apologize and got there anyway. She didn't complain. Told him she'd slept on worse, in wagons, on porches, once on the bare ground outside a boarding house that wouldn't let her father's debts inside the door. He heard her moving overhead along, while before the cabin went quiet. Small sounds, a trunk lid, a breath held and released. He lay on the cot below and listened to a stranger settle into the shape of a life neither of them had chosen, and found himself hoping in a way that surprised him with its intensity that the shape would end up fitting her better than it had any right to. Thursday came in cold. A skin of ice had formed overnight on the water trough. The aspens had shed the last of their gold to a wind that didn't care what season it was interrupting. Nathaniel woke before dawn, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he shaved. Found a clean shirt folded at the bottom of his trunk, dark wool, the one his mother had picked out for him years back. For Sundays he no longer kept. He looked at himself in the flat of his hunting knife. Closest thing to a mirror the cabin had. Saw what he expected to see. A man who'd lived hard, mostly outdoors, mostly alone. Not much to be done about that with a razor and a clean shirt. Except he caught himself thinking it. Stopped. Started again. Except maybe there was something to be done about it. Maybe that was the whole point of today. He didn't let himself finish that thought either. Just pulled the shirt on and stepped outside. Rosalind was already at the fence. She wore a dress the color of winter sage. Deep gray-green. Small pearl buttons catching the gray morning light. Pressed the night before. He could tell by the crease still holding at the shoulders. Hair pinned different than the day she'd walked up his road. Pinned at the sides, left loose behind, and she stood straight in the cold, with her hands folded at her waist like she'd been standing there deciding whether straight was a thing she could hold onto for a whole ceremony. She looked nothing like the woman who'd arrived 4 days back, with worn-through boots and a face gone past crying. Nathaniel stopped walking, just for a second, just long enough that she noticed. "You look well," he said. Not much, but it was what he had. She glanced down at the dress, smoothed a hand over the fabric. Unnecessary. Nervous. "It was my mother's," she said. "The only good thing I brought with me." "It's enough," he said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. They drove into Cedar Draw in his wagon. The town was already stirring. Freighters unloading crates at the mercantile. A blacksmith's hammer ringing out steady. Like a heartbeat the whole street kept time to. 2 boys chasing something down the boardwalk that neither of them was going to catch. Nathaniel didn't say much on the ride in. Rosalind didn't either. But it wasn't the silence from before. Not the careful, watchful kind. Something else. Something neither of them had a name for yet. The circuit judge received them in the back room of the land office. A barrel-chested man named Silas Kettering, who had the air of someone who'd officiated 50 such arrangements, and found every one of them equally routine. One witness, a trapper who'd happened to be waiting on a land deed of his own, and agreed to sign for 2 bits and a promise of coffee. The ceremony took 9 minutes. 9 minutes for the whole of it. For every word that would bind them, for every year that would follow from it, for a debt to a dead man that neither of them had chosen, but both of them intended to honor. When Judge Kettering said the matter was settled, Nathaniel looked at Rosalind. Rosalind looked at Nathaniel. Neither of them moved. Then he offered his arm. She took it, and they walked back out into the cold morning, as husband and wife, the quietest, most ordinary, most significant thing Nathaniel Colburn had done in 36 years of living. They didn't make it back to the wagon before the trouble found them. A man was leaning against the hitching post outside the land office. Lean build, hat pulled low. A stillness to him that wasn't the same as Nathaniel's stillness. Nathaniel's came from patience. This man's came from something colder, practiced, the stillness of a man who got paid to wait. Colburn, the man said, didn't move off the post, didn't offer a hand. Coil. Nathaniel's voice had gone flat like a held breath. Rosalind's fingers tightened on his arm, just slightly, just enough that he felt it. Jessie Coyle looked her over. Slow. The kind of look that wasn't about her at all, and both of them knew it. Heard congratulations were in order, Coyle said. Mrs. Vance sends her regards. Mrs. Vance can send them in writing, Nathaniel said. Same as everybody else. Coyle smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. She thought you might want to reconsider some things, now that you've got more than just yourself to think about. Tell her I've done all the reconsidering I intend to do. I'll tell her. Coyle pushed off the post, unhurried. A man who knew exactly how much time he had, and wasn't in a rush to spend it. She figured you'd say that. He touched his hat brim toward Rosalind. Not respectful. A mockery of respect, thin as paper. Ma'am, he said, and walked off down the boardwalk, whistling something low and tuneless, like a man who'd already gotten everything he'd come for. Neither of them spoke for a while after Coyle rounded the corner. Nathaniel felt Rosalind's hand still resting light on his arm, and found he didn't want to be the one to move first. There's somewhere I'd like to go, she said finally, before we ride home, if it's not too much trouble. He didn't ask where. He already knew. The cemetery sat on a low rise at the edge of town, fenced in with white pickets gone gray. From weather, headstones leaning at angles the ground had chosen for them rather than any mason. Josiah Whitfield's grave was near the back, the earth still dark and settled loose, no stone yet, just a wooden marker Nathaniel himself had carved the week of the burial, because nobody else had stepped forward to do it, and it hadn't felt right, leaving a man like Josiah, with nothing but bare ground to mark where he'd gone. Rosalind knelt, smoothed a gloved hand over the marker's rough-cut letters. Didn't cry. Nathaniel had the sense she'd used up whatever tears she had, out on the road somewhere between the boarding house and his front porch, and what was left now sat further down than crying reached. I got married today, Papa, she said, quiet, like she was continuing a conversation rather than starting one. Didn't think I'd say that sentence for another year at least. Maybe two. A small, unsteady breath. You'd have liked the ceremony. 9 minutes. You always did say a thing done right doesn't need dressing up. Nathaniel stood a little behind her, hat in his hands, same as he'd stood the day of the funeral. Found he had nothing to add. Found, too, that he didn't need to. Some silences were his to fill. This one wasn't. He knew, Rosalind said after a while, not turning around. Didn't he? Somehow he knew all of this was coming, and he built a whole quiet fortress around it, and never once let on. Seems that way. I keep waiting to be angry about it. She touched the marker once more. That he kept it from me. That he decided on his own what I was strong enough to carry, and what I wasn't. Are you angry? She was quiet a long moment. The wind moved low across the little cemetery, stirring dead grass between the markers. No, she said finally. Mostly I just miss him. The anger's in there somewhere, I expect. Hasn't caught up to me yet. Nathaniel crouched beside her. Didn't touch the marker himself. That felt like a thing that belonged to her alone. He carried me 8 miles once, he said quiet. Talked the whole way near as I remember. About nothing important. Weather. A mule he used to own that hated him specifically out of every man in the territory. I think he did it so I wouldn't notice how far we still had to go. Rosalind glanced at him. something soft crossing her face despite everything. That sounds exactly like him. Figured you'd want to know that part. She reached over, set her hand briefly over his, there in the cold grass beside her father's grave, and neither of them said anything more about it. Some things didn't need saying twice. Rosalind didn't ask until they were back on the wagon, back on the road, cedar draw shrinking small behind them. Who is Mrs. Vance? Not really a question. More like she already suspected the answer wouldn't be a comfortable one, and wanted to hear it anyway. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road. Margaret Vance runs the biggest cattle operation north of the river. And that man works for her. Doing what? Nathaniel didn't answer right away, because there wasn't a short version of that answer. Because Margaret Vance had wanted his land for 2 years now, wanted the creek access that ran through it, and he'd turned her down every single time, and every single time she'd taken it a little more personal than the last. Because now there was a wife in the wagon beside him, and Jessie Coyle had looked at her the way a man looks at leverage. She wants my land, he said finally. I don't sell. That's the whole of it. That man didn't look like the kind who takes not selling for an answer. No, Nathaniel admitted. He doesn't. Rosalind was quiet a while after that. The wagon wheels ground over frozen ruts. The wind cut low across the flats. My father knew about this, she said. Not quite a question either. Some of it. And he sent me here anyway. Nathaniel looked at her then. Just once. Just long enough to see she wasn't afraid. Exactly. Something harder than afraid. Something closer to resolved. Your father, he said, didn't do much of anything without a reason. I'm starting to think he had more reasons for this than either of us knows yet. Night came down hard, and fast, the way it did in late October, like the sky had somewhere better to be, and wasn't waiting around for the sun to finish its business. They ate supper in near silence. Rosalind had found the flour, the little bit of dried meat, made something out of near nothing, that Nathaniel ate slower than he needed to, just to make it last. Afterward, she washed the plates. He banked the stove. Small motions, careful ones. Two people learning the shape of a room they now shared, learning where not to bump into each other, where the other one's silence started and stopped. It was near midnight when the shot came. One crack, sharp, out past the tree line, close enough that the horses screamed, and threw themselves against the lean-to-rails. Nathaniel was up, and at the door, before Rosalind had even understood the sound for what it was. Rifle in hand, bare feet on cold floorboards, and he didn't feel the cold at all. Stay inside, he said. Low, final. She didn't stay inside. She was 2 steps behind him when he reached the porch, and neither of them said anything about that because there wasn't time. The night was dark, cloud cover thick enough to swallow the moon hole. But out past the fence line, just at the edge of what the porch lamp could reach, something moved. A shape on horseback. Still, watching. Coyle, Nathaniel said. Not a question. The shape didn't answer. Didn't need to. Just sat there a long moment, letting them both feel the weight of being watched, before it wheeled the horse around, and rode off into the dark unhurried, like a man who'd said everything he'd come to say, without speaking a single word. Rosalind was breathing hard. Her hand had found the porch rail, and gripped it white-knuckled. That was a warning, she said. Yes. For me. Or for you. Nathaniel lowered the rifle, looked at her in the thin lamplight, at the fear she was holding down hard, holding down the way her father must have taught her to hold down everything that threatened to spill over. Both of us now, he said. I suppose that's the arrangement. She didn't answer that. Just stood there a long moment, staring out at the dark, where the rider had gone, and Nathaniel watched something settle over her face. Not fear anymore. Not exactly. Something closer to her father's fierceness. Coming up to meet whatever was coming for them. They didn't sleep much that first night. Nathaniel took the floor by the door, rifle across his knees, though he'd have told anyone who asked that he was only being cautious, nothing more. Rosalind lay on the cot, eyes open in the dark, listening to the wind test the shutters same as it had the night before, except now every sound meant something. Every sound might be Coyle's horse, might be worse. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, she spoke into the dark. Nathaniel. First time she'd said his given name. It landed strange in the quiet cabin. Strange and not unwelcome. Yes. Was my father protecting you? All these years. Is that what this is? He didn't answer right away, because he was turning the question over the same way he'd turned over the letter and finding new edges on it every time. I don't know yet, he said finally, but I intend to find out. She didn't say anything more after that. Eventually her breathing evened out, slid into sleep, the kind of sleep that comes after a body's been running too long on fear, and finally lets go. Nathaniel didn't sleep. Sat there in the dark with the rifle across his knees, thinking about Josiah Whitfield. About look after her, and I know what I am asking, and a debt that was starting to feel less like gratitude, and more like a promise made a long time, before Nathaniel had ever understood he was part of it. The land office in Cedar Draw kept records going back further than the town itself had reason to. Nathaniel rode in 3 days later. Left Rosalind at the cabin with the rifle, within reach and strict instructions not to answer the door for anyone she didn't know, and half the people she did. He found the clerk, a narrow man named Otis Pruitt, hunched over a ledger like it owed him money. Need to see the filing history on my parcel, Nathaniel said. Section 9. North of Cedar Draw. Pruitt squinted up at him. Colburn's place. That's right. The clerk pulled the ledger down. Flipped pages with the slow deliberateness of a man who had nowhere better to be and no particular urgency about getting there. Here we are, he said. Filed 1875. Your name on it, clean and clear. He kept flipping. Frowned. Flipped again. Ha! What? There's a lien filed against the water rights back in 76. Vance Cattle Company. Pruitt looked up. Contested the same year. Withdrawn. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Withdrawn by who? Says here. Pruitt traced the line with one ink-stained finger. Withdrawn following counter-filing by J. Whitfield. On your behalf. The room went quiet around Nathaniel. Quiet the way it had gone quiet the day he read Look after her for the first time. Josiah filed against Vance, he said. Slow. Like he was testing whether the words would hold weight if he said them out loud. On my land, without telling me. Looks that way. Pruitt shrugged, unbothered. A man who dealt in facts and left the feelings to somebody else. Same thing happened again in 80. Another Vance filing. Another Whitfield counter. Nathaniel stood there a long moment, looking at the ledger, at Josiah's name, entered twice, quiet as a held breath, doing something Nathaniel had never once known about, never once thanked him for, because he'd never once known there was anything to thank him for. 7 years. Since the very season Josiah pulled him off, that trail with an arrow, through his shoulder, Josiah Whitfield had been standing between him and Margaret Vance and never said a word, because that's who Josiah was. A man who did the work and let the credit go unclaimed. And now Josiah was gone. And the shield was gone with him. And Margaret Vance, Nathaniel understood now, standing in that narrow office, with the cold coming in under the door, Margaret Vance had waited a long time for this exact moment. Waited for the one man standing between her and that creek to finally run out of protection. She just hadn't counted on Rosalind. He rode home slow, needed the time to think, and the horse seemed to understand that, taking the trail at an easy walk, while Nathaniel turned the whole of it over in his mind. Look after her. That is all I ask. That is all I have ever asked. Except it wasn't all Josiah had ever asked. It was the last thing. The last in a long line of things the man had done quiet and unclaimed, going back years, going back to an arrow wound, and 8 miles carried in the dark, and Nathaniel was only now starting to see the shape of the whole debt, laid out end to end. He found Rosalind in the garden when he got back, wrapped in her shawl, pulling the last of the root vegetables, before the ground froze solid. She looked up when she heard the horse, and something in her face asked the question, before her mouth did. "What did you find?" she said. Nathaniel dismounted, stood there a moment, the reins loose in his hand, looking at her the way a man looks at someone he's about to hand a piece of the truth to, knowing it'll change how she sees everything that came before. "Your father's been fighting Margaret Vance for 7 years," he said, "on my behalf. Filing against her every time she came for this land. Never told me, never told anyone, far as I can tell." Rosalind went still, a root vegetable forgotten in her hand. "Why," she said, barely more than a breath. "I don't know yet," Nathaniel said. "But I think that letter he wrote you, look after her, I think that was never just about you needing looking after." He looked past her, toward the ridge, toward the direction Jessie Coyle's horse had gone 3 nights back. "I think it was about this land staying out of Vance's hands. And I think your father knew, better than either of us did, that the day he died she'd come for it hard. And she has." Rosalind set the root vegetable down, wiped her hands on her apron, slow, giving herself a moment, before she spoke again. "He never once let on," she said, quieter now, something working behind her eyes. "I used to think I knew every corner of that man. Every debt he carried, every kindness he'd done. Turns out he kept a whole life's worth of it folded up small enough that even I never felt the weight of it." "Some men carry things that way," Nathaniel said. "Learned it myself. Ask a man like that why, and he'll tell you the weight's easier to carry when nobody else knows it's there." "Is that why you never told anyone? About the arrow? About the 8 miles? Wasn't mine to tell. Was his kindness. Telling it around felt like spending something that wasn't mine to spend." Rosalind looked at him a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, some private reckoning he wasn't privy to. "Then we finish what he started," she said. Not a question, not a plea. A decision, plain and final, delivered in the same voice she'd used 4 days back to say my father said you needed a wife. A voice that had learned, somewhere along the way, not to waste words on anything less than the truth. Nathaniel looked at her a long moment. "Yes," he said, "we do." And behind them, unnoticed by either, a hawk turned slow circles over the red rock ridge, same as it had the day she first walked up his road, patient, watchful, the way something watches, when it already knows how the story bends, and is simply waiting for the 2 people inside it to catch up. That night, Nathaniel sat at the rough-hewn table long, after Rosalind had gone to sleep, the letter spread flat in front of him under the low light of the oil lamp. He read it again, slower this time, slower than he'd ever let himself read it. "I know what I am asking. I know what you are." The words pulled him back, unbidden, to the exact afternoon they described. 7 years back. Autumn then too, though further along than this one, the aspens already bare. He'd been riding the high trail alone, foolish about it in the way young men are foolish, certain the years, since the war had made him careful enough to outlast any trouble the territory could offer. He'd been wrong. The arrow had come, from nowhere he ever identified, buried itself deep in his shoulder, and taken him clean off his horse, into the rocks below the trail. He remembered the sky more than the pain, oddly. Remembered staring up at it, gray and enormous, and thinking, with a strange and total calm, that this was likely how it ended. Alone on a trail nobody rode in November. His horse already bolted for home without him. Then Josiah Whitfield's face, blotting out the sky. The man hadn't panicked, hadn't wasted breath asking questions that wouldn't change anything. Just got an arm under him, said something short and steadying that Nathaniel couldn't now recall the exact words of, only the tone of a man who had decided immediately and without debate that this stranger was not going to die on his watch. 8 miles. In the dark, most of it the last light failing before they'd covered half the distance. Josiah had talked the entire way, as Nathaniel had told Rosalind at the graveside, about nothing that mattered, a stubborn mule, a bad winter years back, the proper way to smoke a trout, because talking kept a wounded man's mind somewhere other than the wound, and Josiah had understood that the way he seemed to understand most things that mattered without ever making a show of the understanding. 2 nights after, sitting up through a fever that came close twice to finishing what the arrow started. Josiah hadn't slept either night, hadn't asked, once the fever finally broke, for anything in return, had simply saddled up on the third morning and ridden on like a man who considered the matter closed the moment it no longer needed his attention. Nathaniel had tried more than once over the years to repay it somehow. Josiah had always turned the offer aside, gentle but immovable, the way he turned aside most things offered in gratitude, as though gratitude itself made him uncomfortable in some old, private way he never explained. Now Nathaniel understood why. A man who kept a whole valley's worth of quiet debts didn't have room left to collect on his own. He understood it now, or thought he did. Josiah hadn't just been asking Nathaniel to marry his daughter. He'd been asking him to keep fighting a war Josiah could no longer fight himself. Asking him to become, in his own quiet way, exactly what Josiah had been for 7 unspoken years. A wall between Rosalind Whitfield and a world determined to take everything from her. Except now the wall had a name, Nathaniel Colburn, and Margaret Vance had just found out the wall came, with a wife standing beside it, every bit as unwilling to bend as the ground itself. Outside, the wind had finally settled. The horses had gone quiet in the lean-to, and somewhere past the ridge, past the dark, a woman who had wanted this land for 2 years was sitting in a lit room of her own, counting the days until the last thing standing between her and the creek finally ran out of reasons to say no. She was wrong about that. Nathaniel folded the letter closed, set it beneath the lamp, and for the first time in 7 years, felt something other than tired settle into his chest. Something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of a fight he intended to win. Wyoming Territory, 1883, continuing into 1884. Weeks did what weeks do. They passed. Except they didn't pass the way Nathaniel expected. He'd figured on awkwardness stretching out long. Figured on 2 strangers circling each other in a one-room cabin, until one of them broke first. Nobody broke. Instead, there was a rhythm. Small at first, barely there. Rosalind up before him some mornings, the stove already ticking, with heat by the time he pulled his boots on. Him splitting extra kindling without being asked, stacking it by the door, where her hands would find it easy. Neither of them mentioned it, because mentioning it would have made it a thing. And neither of them was ready yet for it to be a thing. She kept the accounts. Turned out Josiah hadn't been exaggerating. She took Nathaniel's scattered ledger, ink smudged, half the entries just guesses dressed up, as arithmetic, and inside 3 days had it running straighter than it had run in 7 years. "You've been overpaying the feed merchant," she told him one evening. Flat. No triumph in it. Just fact. "Have I? $11 over the season, maybe closer to 14. She didn't look up from the ledger. "You should ask for a better rate. Or I will." "You do it better." "I know." A pause. Then almost a smile. That wasn't a question. Nathaniel found himself watching her more than he meant to. Watching the way she moved through the cabin like she'd always belonged in it. Watching the set of her jaw when she worked something out on paper. Watching and then catching himself watching and looking away fast like a man caught somewhere he had no business being. Because he did have business being there. That was the strange part. This was his house, his table, his wife, sitting across from him with ink on her fingers. And still it felt like trespassing on something he hadn't earned yet. There was a day early in that stretch when a hard freeze caught the water pump, before either of them thought to wrap it, and Nathaniel spent the better part of an afternoon working it loose, with hot rags and patience while Rosalind stood by, with more hot water than the job strictly required, handing it over before he asked, like she'd already guessed what he needed 3 steps ahead of him needing it. "You didn't have to stand out here the whole time," he said. Once the pump finally gave, and cold water ran clean again. "I know. Could have stayed by the stove." "I know that too." She capped the empty kettle, unbothered. Didn't want to. He didn't press her on it. Didn't need to. There was a particular kind of company that didn't require explaining itself, and he was only just now, at 36 years old, learning what it felt like to have somebody offer him that kind without being asked. That evening, hands still raw from the cold, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in longer than he could easily count, sitting at his own table, in his own home, simply enjoying the ordinary fact of another person's presence across. From him, no crisis pending, no threat on the road, just two people and a pot of stew, and a quiet that had stopped, somewhere along the way, feeling like something either of them needed to fill. The garden failed slower than he expected. Rosalind wouldn't let it die easy. Covered the last rows against frost with old sacking, salvaged what she could, dried the rest hanging from the rafters until the cabin smelled like sage and onion and wood smoke all at once all the time. She negotiated the winter wheat price down at the mercantile in Cedar Draw. Came home with a look on her face like she'd won a duel. "Mr. Hollis tried to charge me the outsider rate," she said, setting her basket on the table. "Told him I'd been running these accounts 3 weeks, and already knew what fair looked like. What did he say to that? He gave me the local rate, a beat. Then he asked if I did books for other people. Do you? Not yet." She hung her shawl by the door. "Might be worth asking around." Nathaniel watched her say it. Watched the way she said might be, careful, testing whether this was a life she was allowed to want out loud. And something in his chest went tight and warm at the same time, an unfamiliar combination, one he didn't have a name for and wasn't in any hurry to name. At supper, the talk stayed practical. Weather, livestock, what needed mending before the ground froze solid. But it stretched, slow, without either of them deciding to let it. She told him about Oregon Territory, about following her father from one trade to the next, trapper, then preacher's aide, then something close to a lawman, though nobody ever gave him the badge to make it official. He never stayed anywhere long, she said. Said roots were for trees. Men were meant to keep moving. And you. I wanted roots. She turned her coffee cup slow between her hands. Never told him that. Didn't seem right, wanting something he didn't. Nathaniel told her about Missouri, about coming west with $40 and a horse that died 2 days after he arrived, and the stubborn conviction that the territory owed him nothing, and he owed it everything. "You don't ask for much, do you?" she said. Not quite a question. Asking invites disappointment. My father used to say that men who expect nothing from the world are usually the ones who deserve the most from it. Nathaniel looked at her a long moment, then picked up his coffee. "Your father," he said, "was frequently right." Rosalind laughed. Quiet, brief, surprised herself with it, the sound catching in her throat like she hadn't used that particular muscle in a long while. It changed the air in the cabin. After that, the silences felt different, less like distance, more like the kind of quiet two people share once they've stopped being strangers and haven't yet decided what they're becoming instead. Some evenings she read to him from the one shelf of books, her voice steadying the room the way his silence used to steady it alone. He didn't tell her he liked the sound of it. He didn't need to. She could tell by the way he stopped mending whatever was in his hands and simply listened, eyes on the fire, some old tension easing out of his shoulders one page at a time. He came in December. Nathaniel was mending the lean-to roof when he heard hoofbeats on the frozen road, slow and even, a rider in no hurry. He came down off the ladder with the hammer still in his hand, because a man learned to hold onto whatever was nearest when riders came unannounced in this territory. Except this rider he knew, broad-shouldered, beard gone gray early, same as his own hair had started going at the temples. A limp in the left leg that hadn't been there the last time Nathaniel saw him, 11 years back, both of them younger, and neither of them whole. "Emmett Boyle," Nathaniel said, and something in his chest loosened, all at once. A knot he hadn't known was still tied. "Colburn." Emmett swung down off the horse, slow, favoring the leg. "Heard a rumor you'd gone, and got yourself married. Word travels. Word travels fast. When it's about the last man in the territory anybody figured would do it." Emmett grinned, and it was the same grin Nathaniel remembered from a decade back, the one that used to mean trouble was coming or trouble was leaving, and either way it was going to be worth watching. "Figured I'd come see for myself." They'd served together. 2 years, give or take. Emmett had been the one, who pulled Nathaniel out of a ditch outside a battlefield. Nathaniel still didn't say the name of out loud, not even to himself. Nathaniel had returned the favor twice, over before the war finished, with both of them. They didn't talk about that. Not directly. Men who'd been through it rarely did. But it sat between them anyway, unspoken, the way old debts sit between old friends, not owed anymore exactly. Just remembered. Held on to, careful, like something you don't want to lose even though you never planned to spend it. The leg, Nathaniel said, nodding at it. Winter in the Black Hills. A mine that wasn't as played out as the man selling it claimed. Emmett shrugged. Easy, like the subject didn't cost him anything to raise. Left me limping and him buried under it. Fair trade some days. Pour one on others. You're staying, Nathaniel said. Not a question. Figured I might, if you'll have me. Winter work, or however long it takes till spring finds me somewhere better to be. There's a bunk in the barn loft. There's a woman in your cabin I'd very much like to meet first. Nathaniel almost smiled. Almost. Come on, then. Rosalind liked him immediately. Nathaniel could see it happen, quick as a struck match, the way she sized Emmett up on the porch, decided something about him in under a minute, and let her guard down that same minute, further than she'd let it down for anyone but Nathaniel himself. You're the one who dragged him out of a ditch, she said, over supper that first night. Not a question. A fact she'd apparently already extracted, somehow, in the 20 minutes since Emmett arrived. Dragged him out of 2 ditches, Emmett corrected. First one, he tried to argue with me about it. Man had a hole clean through his leg and wanted to debate the merits of staying put. That sounds like him. You've known him 3 weeks. Long enough. Nathaniel sat there and let them talk about him like he wasn't in the room, and found, to his own surprise, that he didn't mind it. Found he liked watching the two of them find their footing with each other. Found the cabin felt bigger somehow, and warmer, with a third voice filling the corners of it, because that's what family did. He hadn't had much practice with it, but he was starting slow to recognize the shape of it when it showed up. The first real test of the 3 of them came, before Christmas, in a storm that blew down off the peaks, with no warning worth the name, turning an ordinary afternoon into something dangerous inside of 20 minutes. One of the young geldings had gotten loose from the near pasture, spooked by the first crack of thunder, and by the time anybody noticed, the snow had come down thick enough to swallow tracks, as fast as they were made. I'll go, Nathaniel said, already reaching for his coat. You'll go with me, Emmett said, already reaching for his own. Man loses a horse alone in a storm like this. Sometimes the horse isn't the only thing that goes missing. Rosalind was at the door, before either of them finished arguing about it, a second lantern already lit in her hand. I'm not staying behind to worry, she said, in a tone that made clear the sentence wasn't up for debate. I know this land near as well as you do by now, Nathaniel Colburn. Better in the dark, since I've had less time to grow careless about it. He didn't argue. There wasn't time, and some part of him, buried under the worry, was glad of the company. They found the gelding an hour later, wedged into a shallow ravine 2 miles east, spooked half to death, but unhurt, and it took all 3 of them working together, Emmett talking it down low and steady, Rosalind holding the lantern, so its light wouldn't spook the animal further, Nathaniel working the rope free from a tangle of brush to get it calm enough to lead home. By the time they made it back, the storm had eased to a hard, steady snow, and all 3 of them were soaked through and half frozen and strangely laughing about it in the particular giddy way people laugh when a thing that could have gone badly instead went fine. You should have seen your face, Emmett said to Nathaniel, stripping off his wet coat by the stove. When that gelding bolted the wrong way past you, man looked like he'd seen a ghost wearing a saddle. I looked composed. You looked like a man who'd forgotten every word he knew. I said plenty. You said one word, Colburn, and it wasn't fit for present company. Rosalind, hanging her own coat by the door, laughed outright at that, the real laugh, the one that had started showing up more often lately, the one that filled the whole cabin when it came. Which word? She asked. Wouldn't dream of repeating it, ma'am, Emmett said, entirely too pleased with himself. Wouldn't want to shock the new bride. I've heard worse from my own father, mending a wagon wheel in the rain. Then you'll hear worse still living here. Nathaniel let them go on about it, warming his hands over the stove, watching the two of them settle into an easy rhythm that felt more each week, like something he'd been missing without knowing its shape. He thought, standing there soaked and cold, and entirely content in a way he hadn't expected to be, that a man could build a whole life out of nights like this one, small dangers weathered together, followed by dry clothes and bad jokes and a warm stove. It wasn't much to ask for. He was beginning to understand everything. Emmett earned his keep fast. Strong back despite the leg. Good hands with the horses. And he brought something else. Something Nathaniel hadn't realized the ranch was missing. Until it arrived. Another set of eyes on the road. Another gun if it came to that. Because it was going to come to that. Nathaniel felt it building the way a man feels weather changing in his joints, before the sky admits to anything. Jesse Coyle hadn't come back since the wedding night, but absence wasn't peace. Absence was Margaret Vance deciding her first move hadn't worked, and taking her time deciding on the second. Rosalind ran into him at the Mercantile in mid-December, of all the ordinary places, standing near the flour barrels like any other man doing business in town. She saw him before he saw her, considered, for half a second, stepping around to the next aisle and letting the moment pass unmarked. Decided against it. Decided, instead, to walk straight past him toward the counter, chin level, same as she'd walked up Nathaniel's road 2 months back, with nothing left to lose. Mrs. Colburn. Coyle touched his hat, that same thin mockery of respect. Didn't expect to see you in town alone. I'm not alone. I'm exactly where I mean to be. Cold ride back to that cabin, especially with winter coming on hard this year. He said it easy, conversational, the way a man discusses weather. Be a shame if something happened to make that ride harder than it needs to be. Is that a threat, Mr. Coyle, or just poor manners? Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise. Maybe that she hadn't flinched. Just an observation, ma'am. Then observe this. Rosalind stepped half a pace closer, close enough that her voice didn't need to carry past the two of them. My husband buried men who tried harder than you're trying. My father taught me to read a contract before I could read a hymnal. Whatever Mrs. Vance is paying you to say to me, I'd think hard about whether it's worth what it'll cost you when this is finally over. Coyle's jaw tightened. For a moment, something almost like respect crossed his face, quickly buried under the practiced coldness he wore like a second coat. You've got spirit, he said. Mrs. Vance said as much after the wedding. Said it was a pity it wouldn't be enough. Tell Mrs. Vance, Rosalind said, that she's welcome to keep underestimating me. Everyone else who's tried has regretted it eventually. She walked past him to the counter, without waiting for a reply, and didn't look back, though she felt his eyes on her the whole time she counted out coins for the flour and the thread she'd come for. She told Nathaniel that evening, plain and unshaken, the way she told him most things. He's testing you, Nathaniel said, something dark moving behind his own eyes, seeing how far he can push before somebody pushes back. I pushed back. I heard. A pause. Proud of you for it. Also intend to have a word with him myself next chance I get. I don't need defending, Nathaniel. Didn't say you did. He met her eyes steady. Said I intend to have a word. Different thing entirely. She didn't argue that. Some battles, she was beginning to understand, belonged to both of them at once, and there wasn't much use pretending otherwise. You've got a look, Emmett said one evening, out at the fence line, the two of them checking posts before full dark. Same look you used to get before a bad night. Bad nights don't announce themselves. No. But men who've survived a few of them get better at smelling one coming. Nathaniel didn't answer that. Just kept walking the fence line, checking wire, and Emmett let the silence stand because that was another thing men who'd been through it understood when to talk, and when the not talking was doing the talking well enough on its own. January came in hard. Snow first, then a cold snap that turned every breath into something visible, something that hung in the air a second too long before disappearing. Nathaniel woke to the smell of smoke. Not stove smoke. He knew stove smoke the way he knew his own heartbeat, familiar past noticing. This was different, sharper, chemical in a way would smoke never was. The smell of something large being consumed that had no business burning. He was outside in under 30 seconds. Boots half-laced, rifle already in hand, some instinct from years back doing the thinking, before his conscious mind caught up. The hay barn. Flames had already taken the east wall. Climbing toward the roof with a kind of lazy confidence, the confidence of a fire that already knew it was going to win, unless somebody stopped it fast. Emmett! He didn't have to shout twice. Emmett came out of the loft above the horse stalls half-dressed, already moving, already understanding the shape of the emergency, before he'd fully woken into it. And then Rosalind, out the cabin door with a blanket in one hand, a bucket in the other, before Nathaniel had even finished shouting her name. Pump, Nathaniel said. Just the one word. She was already running for it. They fought it for an hour. Nathaniel and Emmett hauling water, beating back flame, with wet sacking, coughing in air gone thick and acrid. Rosalind at the pump the whole time, arms burning, hauling bucket after bucket, never once stopping to ask if she should keep going. They saved the structure. Barely. The east wall was gone entirely. Most of the winter hay reduced to smoking ash. The horses had been out in the near pasture, which was the only piece of luck the night handed them. When it was finally out, finally, truly out, nothing left but smoke curling up, into a sky just starting to gray, with dawn, the three of them stood in the snow and looked at what remained. Rosalind's face was streaked with ash. Her hands, when Nathaniel took one of them without quite deciding to, were red raw, from the cold water, shaking not from cold, from the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained, desperate effort, after a body's spent everything it had, and is only now discovering there's nothing left to spend. He found her coat, where she'd dropped it running out, put it around her shoulders. She didn't thank him, not right away, just kept staring at the ruined wall, her expression moving past shock into something colder, something purposeful. She did this, Rosalind said. Not a question. Emmett crouched at the base of the burned wall, ran 2 fingers through the blackened snow, brought them up to his nose. Kerosene, he said. Quiet. Not the stove line, not the lamp connection either. Started here, outside wall. He looked up at Nathaniel. Somebody wanted this to look like accident. Didn't much care whether it did. How far off would you need to be to torch a wall and not get caught doing it? Nathaniel asked. Not far. Minute and a half of nerve. Man knows what he's doing. He's in and gone, before anybody's boots hit the floor. Rosalind was looking at something past both of them. A canteen, half buried in trampled snow 20 yards off, dropped or forgotten in the dark. She walked to it, picked it up. An embossed letter on the strap. A single letter worked into the leather. V. She carried it back, held it out without a word. Nathaniel took it, turned it over once in his hands, felt something settle in his chest, cold and certain, colder than the morning air. Vance, he said. Or somebody wanted us to think Vance, Emmett said. Careful. The voice of a man who'd learned, the hard way, not to trust the first explanation a battlefield offered him. Either way, Nathaniel said. We ride into Cedar Draw. Sheriff needs to see this before the snow covers anything else. Sheriff Amos Bridger was a methodical man. Didn't move fast. Moved sure, which Nathaniel had come to respect more than fast, over the years, having seen what fast got a man in situations that called for careful instead. He listened to the whole account without interrupting, studied the canteen, studied the description of the kerosene pattern, the tracks in the snow, everything Emmett had read off the ground like a man reading a book he'd studied cover to cover before. I know a man does odd jobs for the Vance operation, Bridger said. Been in trouble with me twice already, nothing that stuck. Name's Abel Crane. Bring him in, Nathaniel said. On a canteen and a burn pattern? Judge'll laugh me out of the courthouse. Then find something that won't get laughed at. Bridger studied him a long moment, then nodded slow and pulled his coat off the hook, without another word, which Nathaniel had learned over the weeks was about as close to a promise as the sheriff ever came. They found Abel Crane at the Continental 2 mornings later, which told its own story. A man doesn't drink himself sideways at 9 in the morning, unless something's sitting heavy enough on his conscience to need drowning. Bridger was thorough. Crane was not built for pressure. By noon, he'd given a statement. Margaret Vance had paid him $30 to torch the east wall. Told him to make it look bad enough that Colburn would understand staying on. That land wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Told him, too, and this was the part that made Bridger's jaw go tight, the part he repeated back to Nathaniel later that same afternoon, low, like the words themselves tasted bad. Told him there'd be more work coming, if this didn't finish the job. Other properties. Other fires, maybe, if fire was what it took. Other properties, Nathaniel repeated. That's what he said. Bridger's expression had gone grim in a way Nathaniel hadn't seen on him before. Sounds like your place isn't the only one she's got her eye on. Word moved through Cedar Draw the way water moves, through a canyon, fast, and finding every low place along the way. By the week's end, 3 other ranchers had come forward. Quiet at first, then less quiet, once they understood they weren't the only ones who'd been approached. The Hallorans, north of the river, had been offered a buyout 8 months back. Refused. Found their well fouled a month later, dead livestock upstream, no proof of who'd done it, no proof that would hold up. Anyway. Old man Tilford, whose land backed onto the same creek that fed Nathaniel's property, had simply sold. Quiet, quick, for less than the land was worth, and left the territory without saying goodbye to anybody. Nobody had thought much of it at the time. Men left the territory all the time. Now it looked different. Now every quiet sale, every unexplained hardship going back 2 years, looked like a piece of the same picture, and the picture Margaret Vance was painting covered a great deal more ground than one man's creek access. Nathaniel and Emmett rode out to the Halloran place 2 days, after Crane's arrest at Rosalind's insistence, because a name on a list was one thing, and a face across a table was another, and she wanted their account written down proper, in their own words, before anybody had the chance to talk them out of it. Martha Halloran was a broad, sun-weathered woman who met them at her own gate with a shotgun cracked open, over one arm, not raised, just present, the way a person keeps a tool close, that they've had occasion to use before. "You're the Colburn who married Whitfield's girl," she said. "Not unfriendly, just certain." "I am. Heard about your barn." She studied him a moment, then set the shotgun against the fence post, some decision made. "Come on in. My husband's been wanting somebody to tell this to who'd actually listen." Ezra Halloran told it plain, the way a man tells something he's turned over in his mind too many nights to dress it up anymore. The buyout offer low and insulting on its face. The refusal. The well gone bad a month later. Cattle dead upstream of it. No proof, no recourse, just a hard winter made harder, and a debt that had crept up on them since. "We thought it was bad luck," he said. "Told ourselves that for the better part of a year. Man doesn't like admitting somebody did a thing to him on purpose. Feels worse than the doing of it, somehow." "Would you say as much to a hearing?" Rosalind asked, when Nathaniel relayed it back to her that evening. "In front of the whole valley." "He said he would," Nathaniel said. "Once he understood he wasn't the only one saying it." "She's not after your land," Rosalind said, laying it all out on the kitchen table that evening, names, dates, the little she'd been able to gather in an afternoon of careful, deliberate conversation at the Mercantile, and now the Hallorans' account besides. "She's after the whole valley. Your parcel's just the last piece she needs to control the water clean, through to the river fork." Nathaniel looked at the spread of names. At Tilford's, at the Hallorans', at his own, sitting at the bottom of a list that had clearly started long before he'd ever noticed he was on it. "Your father knew this," he said slowly. "Didn't he? That's why he kept filing against her." Not just for me. For the whole valley. Rosalind's jaw tightened. He never said. No, Nathaniel said. He wouldn't. Emmett, leaning against the doorframe, with his arms crossed, let out a low breath. Man built himself a whole quiet war, he said, and left the two of you to finish fighting it, without ever telling either of you the size of what you were standing in. Nobody argued with that. The land office in Cedar Draw felt different walking in the second time. Otis Pruitt looked up from his ledger, and something crossed his face before he could smooth it away. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to dread. Mr. Colburn, he said. Careful. Mrs. Colburn. We need the filing history, Nathaniel said. On the Halloran parcel. And Tilford's before the sale. Pruitt's hand hovered over the ledger a beat too long. I'm not sure I'm at liberty. These are public filings, Mr. Pruitt, Rosalind said. Even, pleasant, almost in a way, that made the words land harder than if she'd shouted them. My father taught me the statute on that when I was 12 years old. I can recite it if it would help refresh your memory. Pruitt's throat worked. He glanced toward the window, toward the street outside, as though checking whether anybody was watching him have this conversation. There's been some irregularity, he said finally, low, almost a whisper, in how some of these filings got recorded. I didn't. He stopped, started again. A man came around, made it clear certain paperwork moved faster if I didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. What man? Nathaniel said. Pruitt's eyes flicked toward the door again. And this time, when he answered, his voice had dropped, so low Rosalind had to lean in to catch it. Younger Vance, he said. Homer, comes in on his mother's business. Except, he hesitated. Except some of what he's brought me lately, I don't believe he agrees with. He's got a look about him, like a man carrying something he wishes he wasn't. Nathaniel and Rosalind exchanged a glance. Where do we find him? Nathaniel asked. Bank, Pruitt said. Works the counter most afternoons. But Mr. Colburn? He hesitated. And for the first time, since they'd walked in, something like genuine concern crossed the clerk's narrow face. Be careful how you go about it. His mother has ears in this town longer than most rivers. They didn't get the chance to seek Homer out. It was 3 days later, riding the north boundary line, with Emmett to check on a section of Fence Crane's arrest had left them too distracted to mend, that the trouble found Nathaniel instead. The trail cut through a narrow stand of pine, snow-heavy branches close on both sides, the kind of ground a careful man didn't love riding through blind. Nathaniel wasn't blind. He felt it before he saw it, the particular wrongness of birds gone silent all at once, a stillness that didn't belong to weather. Emmett. One word. Enough. The shot came from the tree line to their left. Close. Too close for warning, meant to draw blood, not attention. Emmett went down first. Off his horse into the snow, a sound tearing out of him that Nathaniel hadn't heard another man make since the war. Not quite a scream, something worse, something clipped short by will alone. Emmett. I'm a ragged breath. I'm hit. Get down. Get down, Nathaniel. Nathaniel was already off his horse, already dragging Emmett behind the meager cover of a fallen log, rifle up, eyes scanning the tree line, with a focus that felt horribly familiar. Felt like a door he'd spent 7 years keeping shut, kicked open in half a second. A second shot cracked, splintered bark 6 inches from his head. Coil, Nathaniel said, not loud, just certain. No answer came from the tree line. No answer was needed. Nathaniel fired twice into the trees low, not aiming to hit so much as aiming to make the shooter think twice about a third attempt. Then dropped back down beside Emmett, hands already moving, already pressing a folded bandana hard against the wound in Emmett's shoulder. Talk to me, he said. Still, Emmett's breath hitched. Still here. Hurts like hell. That's a good sign, I think. Man who's dying doesn't usually complain this much about it. Shut up and hold still. Yes, sir. Somewhere in the trees, hoofbeats. Retreating. Unhurried. Even now, the same unhurried rhythm Jesse Coyle had ridden away. With the night of the wedding, a man who never seemed to feel the need to run from anything. Nathaniel didn't chase him. Couldn't. Not with Emmett's blood soaking dark into the snow beneath them. Not with a ride of 6 miles still between them and anyone who could help. He got Emmett up onto his own horse. Half carried, half dragged, Emmett's weight heavier than it should have been. Heavier the way wounded men always were. Like the injury itself added its own gravity. "Stay with me," Nathaniel said. Low, urgent. The words coming out rougher than he meant them to. "You hear me. You stay with me." Wasn't planning. Emmett's voice had gone thin. Wasn't planning on going anywhere. "Ditch owes me. I've pulled enough men out of them. Figured it's somebody else's turn to return the favor." Nathaniel didn't answer that. Just swung up behind him, one arm locked hard around Emmett's chest, and rode for home faster than he'd ridden anything in 7 years. Rosalind heard the horse before she saw it. Came out of the cabin already running, already understanding from the pitch of the hoofbeats alone that something had gone badly wrong. "Get the table cleared," Nathaniel shouted, still 50 yards off. "Boil water." Now, Rosalind. She didn't ask questions. That was the thing about her he'd come to count on, without ever saying so out loud. When the moment called for questions, she asked them. When it called for speed, she moved. By the time Nathaniel got Emmett off the horse and into the cabin, the table was cleared, water was on, and Rosalind was already tearing clean linen into strips with hands that didn't shake, not even once, not even looking at the blood soaking through Emmett's shirt. "Where?" she said. "Shoulder. Left side." She had his shirt cut open in under a minute. Studied the wound with a focus that reminded Nathaniel sharply of her going through the land ledgers, the same total, unshakable concentration, applied now to something with a great deal more at stake than acreage. "Bullet's still in there," she said. "I can feel it. Not deep, but it needs coming out before it festers." "You've done this before," Nathaniel said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father broke a rib once, out past the Snake River, 3 days from anybody who called themselves a doctor." She didn't look up from her work. "I was 14. He talked me through it. Said a person only really learns a thing once they've had to do it themselves, with no one else around to do it for them." Emmett, pale and sweating on the table, managed something close to a laugh. "Your father," he said, voice thin. "Sounds like he was a hell of a man." "He was," Rosalind said, and there was something in the way she said it, steady, but with a crack running just beneath the steadiness, that made Nathaniel understand, all over again, how much she was carrying and how quietly she carried it. The bullet came out clean close to an hour later. Rosalind's hands never once faltered, though her face had gone the color of ash by the time she finally set the knife down and pressed a clean dressing hard against the wound. Emmett, half conscious from the pain and the whiskey Nathaniel had poured into him beforehand, muttered something that might have been thank you and might have been nonsense, and then went under proper, exhausted sleep, pulling him down fast. Nathaniel found Rosalind outside afterward, sitting on the porch steps in the cold, her bloodied hands still not quite steady now that the work was done, and there was nothing left to hold them steady for. He sat down beside her. Didn't say anything at first. Just sat, the way she'd sat, with him, silent, on nights that called for silence more than words. "He's going to be all right," she said. Not quite a question. More like she needed to hear it confirmed out loud. "Because of you. Because of luck. And you getting him home fast enough." She looked down at her hands. "I keep thinking, if that shot had landed 2 inches over." "Don't. I can't help it. I know." He was quiet a moment. "I think it too, every time." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way she had the morning of the wedding, when he'd told her she looked well, and meant it more than the words let on. "This is what my father was protecting us from," she said. "All those years, this is what he was standing between." "Yes. And now he's not here to stand between it anymore." "No," Nathaniel said. "Now it's us." She didn't answer that right away. Just looked out at the dark at the ridge where a man had ridden off unhurried, after putting a bullet in someone Nathaniel loved, and the word loved surprised him, arriving unbidden, attaching itself to Emmett easily enough, and then quieter, harder to admit, attaching itself somewhere else too. Somewhere he wasn't ready yet to say out loud. He sat up the whole of that first night, rifle across his knees, same as he had the night of the wedding, except this time the fear wasn't a stranger's warning shot, from a distance. This time it had come close enough to touch, close enough that the smell of Emmett's blood still sat in the back of his throat no matter how many times he swallowed against it. Rosalind came out sometime past 3, wrapped in a blanket, and sat down on the floor beside him without asking permission, without needing to. "You should sleep," he told her. Weak argument, and he knew it even as he made it. "So should you." Neither of them moved. "I keep hearing it," she said after a while, quiet. "The shot, over and over. Like my mind wants to make certain I didn't imagine how close it came." "I keep seeing it," Nathaniel said, just as quiet. "Different sight, but same trouble. A man doesn't forget the particular way another man falls, once he's watched it happen enough times. The war. He didn't elaborate. Didn't need to. She'd learned, these past weeks, when a subject wanted the door left shut, and left it shut now, gentle, without making him ask. "He's going to live," she said instead. "I keep telling myself that. Keep needing to hear it said out loud, even by my own voice, before it feels true." "He's going to live," Nathaniel echoed. "Because you made certain of it. Because your hands didn't shake once the whole hour it took." "They're shaking now." He looked down. They were small, fine tremors, the kind that come after, not during, when a body finally understands it's allowed to stop being brave for a moment. He took one of her hands, without deciding to. Held it, simple, steady, the way a man holds something he intends to keep holding. "Mine too," he admitted. Quiet. An admission that cost him something, and he made it anyway. She looked at him a long moment in the low firelight. Didn't pull her hand back. "Thank you," she said, "for riding fast enough." "Thank you," he said, "for knowing what to do once I got him here." They sat like that a long while, hands joined, the fire burning low, the cabin holding its breath around them the way it seemed to do, more and more, whenever the two of them stopped moving long enough to simply be still together. Emmett healed slow, through the back half of January, propped up in the cabin's single bed, while Nathaniel and Rosalind took turns on the floor, neither of them willing to say which of them minded it less. He was cantankerous about it. Complained the coffee was too weak, then too strong, then just right, and suspiciously so, like Rosalind had done something to it to make him stop complaining. "I did," she admitted, the third time he raised the subject. "Extra grounds. Figured a man recovering from a bullet wound has earned the right to strong coffee at minimum." "Marry me instead," Emmett said, deadpan, and then winced, both from the joke landing wrong, and from the movement pulling at his stitches. "Apologies. Poor timing. Forget I said that." "I already did," Rosalind said, and set his coffee down harder than strictly necessary. Nathaniel, watching from the doorway, felt something in his chest that surprised him with its sharpness. Not jealousy exactly. Something closer to recognition, watching the two people he'd come, without meaning to, without planning to care about more than anything else in the territory, and understanding all at once how much he stood to lose if Margaret Vance got what she wanted. He wasn't going to let that happen, whatever it cost him. It was Homer Vance who came in the end, not summoned, not sought out, just arrived, one gray afternoon in early February, riding up alone, no escort, no announcement, dismounting careful, like a man walking, into a room he wasn't sure would let him leave the same way he came in. Rosalind was the one who answered the door. Nathaniel, hearing the exchange, from inside, was up and moving before the second sentence finished. "Mrs. Colburn," Homer said. Younger than Nathaniel expected, though he'd have put the man near 30. Something tired around the eyes that didn't match the rest of his face. "I need 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." "You work for your mother," Rosalind said. Not an accusation. A fact, laid down flat, waiting to see what he'd do with it. "I do," Homer said, "which is exactly why you should hear me out." Nathaniel appeared in the doorway behind her. Homer's eyes flicked to him, and something in his posture eased slightly, like he'd been bracing for a worse reception, and hadn't quite gotten it yet. "5 minutes," Nathaniel said. Homer nodded, reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, the movement of a man who understood exactly how a fast motion might be read in a house that had recently survived a fire and a shooting both. He held out a folded stack of papers. "My mother keeps 2 sets of books," he said. "One for the bank examiners, one for herself." His jaw worked like the next words cost him something to say out loud. "I've been making copies of the second set for 3 months now. Every filing, every payment to Jesse Coyle, every threat dressed up as a business proposal." Rosalind took the papers, didn't open them yet, just held them, studying Homer's face like she was trying to decide whether to trust what was written inside based on what she could read in the man standing in front of her. "Why?" she said. "You're her son." Something moved across Homer's face. Old grief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "Because I watched her do this to the Hallorans," he said, quiet, "and to Tilford. And I told myself each time it was business. That's all, hard business, nothing personal in it." He looked down at his own hands. "Then I watched her put a bullet in a man who wasn't even hers to be angry at, and I stopped being able to tell myself that story." The wind moved outside, low and cold, testing the shutters the way it always did. "There's a filing in there," Homer went on, "for a hearing, 3 weeks out. Water rights review, whole valley, on account of the recent incidents." His mouth twisted on the word incidents like it tasted wrong. "My mother thinks she controls how that hearing goes. She's wrong. But only if somebody walks in with proof." Nathaniel took the papers from Rosalind's hands, weighed them, the way he'd weighed Josiah's letter months back, like something far heavier than paper had any right to be. "Why bring this to us?" he said. "Why not the sheriff?" "Because the sheriff can arrest Abel Crane," Homer said. "But he can't touch my mother without something that holds up in a hearing room, in front of people who matter, where she can't buy her way out of it after." He met Nathaniel's eyes, steady now, the tired look replaced by something harder. "You want her stopped for good, not just slowed down." "I want the same thing. That makes us the same side, whatever it looks like from the outside." Rosalind studied him a long moment, then looked at Nathaniel. Neither of them said anything for a while, because there wasn't an easy thing to say to a man who just handed them his own mother's downfall, wrapped in paper, delivered with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking the whole time he spoke. 3 weeks, Nathaniel said finally. 3 weeks, Homer confirmed. "Then we'd best get to work." Outside, the wind kept testing the shutters, same as it had the night of the wedding, the night of the fire, the night Emmett's blood had soaked dark into the snow, testing and finding each time that whatever was inside, that cabin had grown a little sturdier than the wind had counted on. And somewhere north of the river, in a house far larger and far colder than Nathaniel's cabin would ever be, Margaret Vance sat by her own fire, entirely unaware that the last piece she needed to control the whole valley had just walked out her own son's door, folded neatly into a stack of papers, riding straight toward the one hearing room in the territory, where her money couldn't follow it. Wyoming Territory, February, 1884. 3 weeks wasn't long. Nathaniel understood that the moment Homer's horse disappeared back down the frozen road. Except 3 weeks was what they had. So 3 weeks was what they'd use. Rosalind took over the papers like she'd been training for this her whole life. Maybe she had. Maybe every ledger she'd ever balanced, every contract her father had made her copy out at 12 years old just for practice, had all been leading here, to a kitchen table covered edge to edge, with Margaret Vance's own handwriting turned against her. "There's a pattern," Rosalind said, one night deep, into the second week, candlelight throwing her shadow long across the wall. Every payment to Coyle routes, through the same account. Same day, near enough as every incident. "You can prove that. I can show it." She looked up. Proving it is what the hearing's for. Emmett, propped in the corner chair, with his arms still in a sling, snorted. Half this territory can't read a filing to save their lives. You put 20 of these pages in front of a hearing room, you'll lose them by page 3. Then I won't give them 20 pages, Rosalind said. I'll give them one, the one that matters most, and I'll make sure they understand exactly what it means before they've had time to get bored of listening. Nathaniel watched her say it, watched the certainty in it, the same certainty she'd had the day she stood on his porch and said, "My father said you needed a wife like a woman who'd decided, long before anyone else caught up to the decision, exactly how a thing was going to go." He believed her. That was new. Believing someone fully without holding some piece of himself back in reserve. He wasn't sure when that had started. Only that it had. There were nights, that second week, when the work went slower than either of them liked, Rosalind's handwriting growing tighter and more furious. As the hours wore on, Nathaniel reading each page back to her twice just to be certain the numbers held together the way she meant them to. "You don't have to sit up with me," she told him, close to midnight one night, not looking up from the ledger. "You've got fence to mend at dawn, same as always. Fence'll keep." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." He refilled her coffee without being asked. "Your father sat up plenty of nights doing work nobody thanked him for. Seems only right somebody sits up with his daughter doing the same." She looked at him a long moment then, something unguarded crossing her face, before she caught it, and turned back to the ledger. Neither of them said anything more about it. They didn't need to. Otis Pruitt came to them 2 days before the hearing. Alone. On foot, same as Rosalind had once come to Nathaniel's door. Like walking felt safer than being seen on a horse that could be recognized. "I'll testify," he said, before either of them could ask. His hands were shaking, but his voice wasn't. "About the filings. About what Homer Vance brought me, and what I let go, through without asking who paid for it." "That could cost you your position," Nathaniel said. "Could cost me a great deal more than that if I don't." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Mr. Colburn, I've kept records in this territory 9 years. I know what honest paper looks like. And I know what it looks like when somebody's paying to make dishonest paper look honest instead." He looked between them, something like shame moving across his narrow face. "I should have said something the first time. I told myself it wasn't my business. Turns out silence is its own kind of business. I'm done being in it." Rosalind reached out, set a hand briefly on his arm. "Thank you," she said. Simple. No more than that needed saying. Pruitt nodded once, sharp, like a man closing a door on his own hesitation, before it could open again. "Thursday," he said. "I'll be there." The hearing was set for the courthouse in Cedar Draw, the same room Nathaniel had signed his own marriage into being 4 months back, though it looked nothing like it had that day. Benches filled early. Word had moved, through the valley the way it always did, fast, finding every low place, and by the time Judge Silas Kettering took his seat behind the bench, there wasn't standing room left along the back wall. Margaret Vance arrived last. Deliberately last, Nathaniel suspected. A woman who understood the value of an entrance. She was smaller than he remembered, from the one time he'd stood across from her at a fence line years back refusing to sell. Dressed in dark wool, silver at her throat, composed in the particular way of someone who had spent decades winning arguments before they'd even properly started. She looked at Nathaniel, at Rosalind beside him, her mouth curved, thin and cold. "Mr. Colburn," she said, passing their bench, "I do hope this won't take long. I have a ranch to run." "We'll try not to inconvenience you," Rosalind said. Pleasant, even. The same tone she'd used on Otis Pruitt, the tone that made words land harder than shouting ever could. Margaret's eyes flicked to her, something assessing in the look, something that hadn't been there 4 months back, when she'd dismissed Rosalind as nothing more than a destitute girl and a practical arrangement. She didn't dismiss her now. Judge Kettering opened the proceedings plain, no ceremony wasted on it. "Water rights review, whole valley, prompted by a string of incidents the territory could no longer pretend were unconnected. Sheriff Bridger spoke first, laid out the fire, the canteen. Abel Crane's statement, given freely, no coercion, signed in his own unsteady hand. Margaret's lawyer, a sharp city man brought up, from Cheyenne for the occasion, rose fast. Mr. Crane is a known troublemaker, Your Honor. His word alone. His word alone, Rosalind said, standing before anyone invited her to. Isn't alone. The room shifted, attention swinging toward her, the wife of the man, whose barn had burned, standing in a courthouse like she had every right to be heard, because she did. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to submit for the record a set of financial filings, provided by a witness, with direct knowledge of the Vance operation's private accounts. Margaret went very still. Objection, her lawyer said. The provenance of these documents. The provenance, Rosalind said, is standing at the back of this room and prepared to speak to it himself if the court will allow. Every head turned. Homer Vance stood near the doorway, hat in his hands, face pale but steady, in the way of a man who'd made peace with a decision days ago and was only now living out the consequence of it. Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough that Nathaniel, watching close, saw it happen. Homer, she said, low, a warning dressed up thin as a question. Her son didn't answer her, walked instead to the front of the room, past his own mother's bench, and took the witness chair like it was the heaviest seat he'd ever sat down in. He testified for the better part of an hour, told the room about the 2 sets of books, about payments to Jesse Coyle that never appeared anywhere an examiner would think to look, about the Halloran's well and Tilford's quiet, underpriced sale, and a pattern going back 2 years that had never once been accident, not a single piece of it. I told myself it was business, he said, near the end, his voice gone rough. I kept telling myself that, every single time, until I couldn't anymore. Margaret's lawyer rose, before Homer had fully left the stand, sharp and quick, the way a man moves, when he senses the ground shifting under his case, and means to catch it, before it falls further. Mr. Vance, he said, isn't it true you've had a strained relationship with your mother for some years now, that this testimony might serve certain personal grievances, as much as any concern for the valley? Homer didn't flinch. I've had a strained relationship with what she's done, yes. Not with her exactly. Those aren't the same thing, though I understand why you'd want the court to think they are. You stand to inherit her operation, do you not? Assuming she's convicted and removed from its management. I stand to inherit a great deal of trouble, more like. Something steady entered Homer's voice, the tired look, from earlier replaced by something closer to resolve. If you're asking whether I want the ranch, the answer's no. I want the water rights settled fair. I want the Hallorans made whole for what they lost. I want to work an honest counter at that bank without wondering, every single day, whose theft I'm quietly enabling by keeping quiet myself. He looked past the lawyer, toward his mother's bench, and for a moment something almost gentle crossed his face. I didn't come here for inheritance, sir. I came here because I couldn't keep sleeping otherwise. The lawyer opened his mouth to press further. Judge Kettering raised one hand, mild but final. I think the witness has answered the question thoroughly enough, Kettering said. Move along, counselor, or sit down. The lawyer sat down. Rosalind, watching from the bench beside Nathaniel, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He held up, she murmured. Man's got more spine than his mother gave him credit for, Nathaniel murmured back. Reckon she's only just now finding that out, same as the rest of us. Across the room, Margaret Vance sat rigid, staring at her own son, with an expression Nathaniel couldn't fully read, something between fury and a grief too old and too tangled to name plainly. Whatever it was, she said nothing, just watched him step down from the witness chair and walk back to the doorway, past her, without once meeting her eyes again. Ezra Halloran spoke after him, plain and unpolished, telling the room what he'd told Nathaniel at his own kitchen table weeks before. the buyout offer, the fouled well, the year he'd spent calling it bad luck, because the alternative was harder to carry. Otis Pruitt followed, his testimony halting at first, and then steadier, laying out exactly how paperwork had moved, through his office faster, when nobody asked where the money behind it came from. Margaret sat through the whole of it without moving. Without speaking. Her face had gone the color of old paper, and something in her eyes, Nathaniel almost felt it, almost before he remembered the fire, the canteen, Emmett's blood dark in the snow, and let the almost pass right on, through him without stopping. Because pity wasn't owed here. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Jesse Coyle was brought in under guard. That same afternoon, Bridger having ridden out for him the moment the hearing's first hour made clear where the wind was blowing. He didn't look unhurried anymore. Didn't look like a man with all the time in the world. Because a charge tied to a shooting, tied to a man nearly bleeding out on a frozen trail, was a rope charge, and Jesse Coyle understood the weight of that well enough to stop being clever about it. "She paid me," he said, before the judge had finished swearing him in, the words coming out fast, like he'd been holding them, so long they'd built pressure behind his teeth. "For the ambush on the North Trail. She wanted Colburn scared off, and when scared didn't work fast enough, after that fire didn't finish the job Crane was hired for, she wanted him hurt instead." "You're claiming Mrs. Vance ordered an attempt on a man's life," Kettering said, flat, giving him the chance to walk it back if he wanted to. "I'm not claiming it." Coyle's eyes cut toward Margaret, and there was nothing left in them of the cold, unhurried man who'd ridden off into the dark twice now, certain of his own untouchability. "I'm telling you it happened," she said. "Get it done however it needs doing. I got it done. Didn't much care for the doing of it if you want the truth, but I did it anyway because that's what she paid for." The room had gone dead silent. The kind of silence that has weight to it. Margaret rose to her feet. "This is..." Her voice cracked, just once, before she caught it, and forced it flat again. "This man will say anything to save his own neck." "Perhaps," Kettering said. "But he said it under oath, in a room full of witnesses, corroborated by a canteen, a burn pattern from Mr. Crane's own confession, and financial records provided by your own son." He looked at her, over his spectacles, and there was nothing warm in the look. "That's a great deal of anything for one man to invent, Mrs. Vance." The hearing broke for the day without a ruling. Kettering wanted the full record reviewed, wanted no piece of it rushed enough to give a Cheyenne lawyer grounds for appeal later. But he said one more thing before he adjourned, and it was the thing the whole valley would repeat to each other in the weeks that followed, in mercantiles and church pews, and across fence lines, from one property to the next. "Whatever comes of the criminal matter," Kettering said, "this court's finding on the water rights question is plain enough already. Every filing Vance Cattle Company has brought against a property in this valley these past 7 years is hereby voided for cause. The creek stays open, all of it, to every family sitting in this room." It didn't sound like much said plain like that, in a tired man's voice at the end of a long day. But Nathaniel felt Rosalind's hand find his under the bench and understood, in that moment, that her father's 7 quiet years had just been made loud, official, and permanent, in front of everyone who'd ever needed to hear it. That still left one more night before the criminal matter was finished. One more night before all of it was truly over. Nathaniel should have felt something like relief walking out of that courthouse. Instead, he felt the opposite. Felt the particular unease of a man who'd cornered something dangerous and hadn't yet watched it stop moving. "She's not done," he said low to Rosalind as they crossed the street toward the wagon. "You think she'll run? I think a woman who's spent 30 years winning doesn't know how to lose quiet." He looked back once, toward the courthouse steps, where Margaret Vance stood rigid beside her lawyer, staring at nothing, or at everything. It was hard to tell which. "I think tonight's the night she decides what losing loud looks like." Rosalind's hand found his arm. "Steady. Then we'll be ready." They rode home in the dark, Emmett's rifle across his one good arm, Nathaniel's own weapon, within reach the whole way, and nobody spoke much, because there wasn't much left to say, that the silence wasn't already saying better. The cabin, when they reached it, looked exactly as they'd left it. Smoke rising thin from the stovepipe banked low that morning. The burned half of the barn standing dark against a sky gone heavy, with cloud still waiting on the timber, and the hands that would raise it again come spring. Nathaniel felt it before anything moved. That same wrongness, from the trail, birds gone silent, air gone still in a way weather alone didn't explain. Inside, he said. Quiet, final. Both of you, now. Except it was already too late for that. Margaret Vance stood at the edge of the porch light, a rifle held loose, but ready in both hands, and behind her, two men Nathaniel didn't recognize, hired fast, hired desperate, the kind of men who worked for whoever paid last instead of whoever paid best. Mrs. Vance, Nathaniel said. Because even was the only thing he had left to offer a situation like this, the only tool that had ever once worked in a moment gone this far past reasoning. Mr. Colburn. Her voice had none of the courthouse composure left in it. Something raw underneath now, something that had been building for 30 years, and had finally run clean out of room to keep building quiet. Do you know what it is? To build something with your own two hands, and watch a room full of strangers decide they have the right to take it from you? I know what it is to have my barn burned, Nathaniel said. My friend shot. My wife threatened twice now on her own wedding night and every night since. He didn't move, didn't let his voice rise, though everything in him wanted it to. I don't imagine those are the same thing, Mrs. Vance, but I expect you'll tell me they are. You don't understand. Something almost pleading crept into her voice, and it was worse, somehow, than the coldness had been. My father lost everything to a bank in St. Louis, 40 years back. Land, cattle, every dollar he'd ever earned, taken by men in a courtroom, who never once set foot on the ground they were arguing over. Her grip tightened on the rifle. I swore I'd never be the one standing on the losing side of that room again. I swore it, and I built this, every acre, with my own hands, and I will not. Her voice broke, finally entirely. I will not watch it taken from me the same way. The wind moved through the yard, cold, patient. So you decided? Rosalind said, stepping half a pace forward despite Nathaniel's hand catching at her sleeve, that the way to keep it from happening to you was to make it happen to everyone else first. Margaret's eyes cut to her, and for one long moment nobody moved. Nobody breathed easy. You don't know anything about it, Margaret said. Lo, I know my father spent 7 years standing between you and every acre of this valley, and never once told a soul he was doing it. Rosalind's voice didn't shake. Not once. I know he understood exactly what you were, Mrs. Vance, and chose to fight it quiet instead of loud, because quiet was what protected the people you'd have crushed otherwise. A beat. I think somewhere under all of this, he was right to. Something moved across Margaret's face. Not quite a crack. Close to one. Behind her, one of the hired men shifted his weight. Nervous. A man realizing, slow, that the job he'd been paid for had stopped looking like the job he'd agreed to. That was when the second set of hoofbeats reached them. Sheriff Bridger, riding in fast, and behind him, more than Nathaniel expected. Half the courthouse gallery, it looked like, men from Cedar Draw who'd sat through that hearing and understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly where the trouble was going to land once night fell. The Hallorans, old man Tilford's grown son, come back from wherever he'd scattered to, after his father sold out and left. Otis Pruitt, of all people, mounted on a borrowed horse, looking terrified and present anyway. Margaret turned, saw the numbers arrayed against her, saw for the first time, since Nathaniel had known of her, the particular math of a losing position laid out plain enough that even 30 years of winning couldn't argue it away. Lower the rifle, Margaret, Bridger said, not unkind, just final. It's over, has been since Coyle opened his mouth this afternoon. Don't make it worse than it already is. The two hired men didn't wait for her answer. Dropped their weapons into the snow fast, hands up, men who'd signed on for money and had no intention of dying for it. Margaret stood alone, rifle still in her hands. And for one taut, terrible moment, Nathaniel thought she might do something neither of them could take back. Then her shoulders dropped. Just slightly, just enough, and the rifle went down into the snow beside her, and something in her face went with it, 30 years of building, all of it, folding in on itself all at once. She didn't speak again, not really, not while Bridger walked her to his horse, not while the valley she tried to claim watched her go, with expressions that held more pity in them than Nathaniel would have guessed possible, given everything she'd cost them. Homer arrived just as they were leading her off, dismounted fast, face-stricken, and for a moment Nathaniel thought there might be one more scene left to play out. There wasn't. Homer just stood there, watching his mother be led toward the road, and said nothing at all, because there wasn't anything left that hadn't already been said in a courthouse that afternoon. "She'll face the territorial court," Bridger said, quiet, to Nathaniel, before he rode off after her. "Conspiracy to commit arson. Conspiracy to attempted murder. That canteen and Coyle's testimony alone will see her sentenced. The rest just makes certain of it." He tipped his hat, brief, toward Rosalind. "Ma'am, that was fine work today. Your father would have been proud, watching you stand up in that courthouse." Rosalind's throat worked. "Thank you, Sheriff." He rode off. The gathered crowd began to scatter, slow, back toward horses, back toward homes that had, for the first time in 2 years, stopped being threatened. And the valley, Nathaniel thought, watching them go, the valley remembered this. Would remember it for years. Not the fire, not the fear, but this neighbors riding out into the cold for people they barely knew, because the alternative was letting one woman's 30-year-old wound keep bleeding out onto everyone around her. That was worth something. He wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it was worth something. Homer stayed a while after the others left. Stood by the fence, hat still in his hands, looking older than he had that morning in the courthouse. "I don't know what happens to a man," he said finally, "when everything he thought he knew about his own mother turns out to be only half true." "You find out," Nathaniel said, "one day at a time, same as anybody finds out anything hard." Homer nodded, slow, looked toward the ridge, toward the direction his mother had gone. "The bank'll need a manager who isn't tangled up in what she did," he said. "I mean to ask for the position honest. See if I can build something on top of the wreckage that doesn't look anything like what she built." "I believe you will," Rosalind said, and meant it. Homer looked at her a long moment, then at Nathaniel. "Your father-in-law," he said. "Sounds like he was the only honest man in this whole territory for longer than anybody realized." A faint, tired almost smile. Glad to know his daughter came out the same way. He mounted up, rode off slow into the dark, and Nathaniel watched him go, thinking of Josiah's letter again, look after her, and wondering if the old man had somehow known, even from the far side of the grave, that the fight he'd started quiet would end this loud, this public, this thoroughly finished. They rode into Cedar Draw the next morning, before the town had properly woken, and walked together to the small cemetery on the rise, where Josiah Whitfield's grave still sat under its plain wooden marker, waiting on the stone Rosalind had ordered back in January, and was still saving toward. Neither of them said much on the walk up. Didn't need to plan what they'd say once they got there. Some things arrived in a person's chest fully formed, needing only the right quiet place to be spoken. Rosalind knelt first, same as she had on her wedding day, and rested her hand flat against the marker. "It's finished, Papa," she said. "Simple. She's in custody. The water rights are ours again, all of them, every family's, not just Nathaniel's." A breath, unsteady but not broken. You'd have liked watching Homer stand up in that courtroom. Took more courage than I think even you'd have guessed he had in him. Nathaniel crouched beside her, hat in his hands, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he had something to add this time. Something he hadn't had the words for, back in October. "I used to think I was paying a debt," he said. "Coming here today, marrying her, all of it." He looked at the marker a long moment. "Turns out you didn't leave me a debt at all, Josiah. You left me a family. Took me the better part of a hard winter to understand the difference." Rosalind glanced at him, something bright and unguarded in her eyes. He'd have liked hearing that, she said. Figured he already knew it. Man like that generally knew things before the rest of us caught up. They stayed a while longer, the morning sun climbing slow over the cemetery fence, the town beginning to stir below them, wagon wheels, a dog barking somewhere, the ordinary sounds of a valley waking up to a day that no longer held the particular weight it had carried for 2 long years. What do we tell people? Rosalind asked as they finally turned to go. When they ask how it started. This. Nathaniel considered that a long moment, walking beside her back down toward the wagon. Tell them your father said I needed a wife, he said, and that he was right, though it took the both of us a good while to understand exactly how right. She smiled at that, the kind that had become, somewhere in the past months, entirely ordinary between them, no longer a rare thing to be surprised by. Good answer, she said. Had a good teacher, he said. Learned plain speaking from a man who never once wasted a word in his life. They rode home together as the sun climbed higher, the valley opening up gold and quiet around them, and neither of them looked back toward the cemetery, because there was nothing left unfinished behind them anymore. Only ahead. Spring came late to the valley that year. It always did. But when it came all at once, the way it always did too, river running fast, and cold, red rock warming slow under an afternoon sun. That finally meant something again. Emmett's arm healed clean, though he claimed the cold still ached in it some mornings. An excuse Rosalind allowed him exactly, as much as it took to get him moving on chores regardless. The barn got rebuilt in April, half the valley turning out to help, the Hallorans, Tilford's son, Otis Pruitt swinging a hammer with more enthusiasm than skill, and Nathaniel found himself, more than once, standing back from the work just to watch it happen. Watch a yard full of neighbors raising a wall together, that had once burned down alone, in secret meant to break something that had turned out instead to be a great deal harder to break than anybody counted on. Martha Halloran brought a whole ham up from her own smokehouse for the noon meal that day and set it down on the table Rosalind had dragged out into the yard and said, plain. Figured it was time this valley started feeding each other instead of just watching each other suffer alone. Nobody argued with that either. It became, without anyone deciding it formally, the first of what would turn into a standing custom whenever one family raised a wall or brought in a harvest short-handed. The rest of the valley showed up with hammers or with food, and nobody kept count of who owed who. It was on one of those spring evenings, mending the last stretch of fence line, before full dark, that Nathaniel finally said the thing he'd been carrying, since sometime around January, since a bullet wound and a courthouse, and a woman who'd stood up for a valley that wasn't fully hers, yet and made it hers anyway. He didn't plan the words, didn't rehearse them, the way he half-suspected other men did. Men who had an easier time with speeches than he'd ever managed. He just set the hammer down, looked at her. I love you, he said, plain, the way he said most things. No theater in it, no apology either. Rosalind set her own hammer down slow, looked at him a long moment, the last of the daylight catching gold in her hair, same as it had the day she first walked up his road half a year, into a life neither of them had chosen, and both of them had chosen to keep anyway. I know, she said, then softer, like she was correcting something that needed correcting. I love you too, Nathaniel. I think I have for a while now. I wasn't certain you'd want to hear it. I want to hear it every day, he said. She smiled, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there, the way it had the night she laughed at his father-in-law's old joke, and changed the air in the cabin, without either of them noticing it happening. Then you will, she said. That summer, the valley told a different story about them than the one it had told in October. Not the man who lived alone and never smiled. Not the girl who'd arrived on foot, with worn-through boots, and a letter pressed against her chest like a shield. Instead they told the story of the garden, that fed half the valley, through a dry August. Of the barn dances Rosalind started organizing the first Saturday of every month. Emmett claiming, loudly and often, that his leg made him unfit to dance, right up until somebody handed him a fiddle instead, and he discovered a talent nobody had asked him about. The first of those dances, in early June, filled the newly raised barn with more lantern light and noise than its walls had ever held, even before the fire, even in the years before Nathaniel had built it at all. The Hallorans came. Tilford's son came with a young woman from the next valley, over he seemed determined everyone should meet. Otis Pruitt came and danced badly, and didn't care in the slightest, laughing at his own missteps loud enough to draw others into laughing with him. Emmett took up the fiddle around sundown, hesitant at first, like a man testing whether an old skill still lived in his hands, and then, finding that it did, played on well past the hour anybody had planned on stopping. Nathaniel stood near the barn doors for the first while, same as he'd have stood at any gathering a year back, present, but apart, watching from the edges the way he'd learned to watch most things. Rosalind found him there, held out her hand, no ceremony to it. "You don't have to," she said, "but I'd like it if you did. I don't dance." Neither did I for days after arriving, with worn-through boots and nothing to my name. Turns out a person can learn most things, given the right reason to. He looked at her hand a long moment, then took it. He was clumsy at first, counting steps under his breath, apologizing twice for missing them entirely. Rosalind laughed, not unkindly, and steered him through it, patient the way she was patient, with the ledgers, with the garden, with every hard thing that had come across their threshold since October. "You're better at this than you're letting on," she said after a while. "I'm terrible at this." "You're terrible at admitting you're not terrible at things. Different problem entirely." Around them, the barn spun with lantern light and fiddle music, and the particular warmth of a valley that had, for 2 years, forgotten how to gather, without fear sitting somewhere in the room, and had only recently remembered. Martha Halloran caught Nathaniel's eye once, over Rosalind's shoulder, and raised her cup toward him in a small, silent toast. He returned it, just as silent, and understood, in that small exchange, something he hadn't fully let himself feel, until that exact moment, that the valley didn't just tolerate him anymore. It had, somewhere in the past hard year, decided to claim him as its own. When the dance finally wound down, past midnight, Emmett still cradling the fiddle like an old friend he'd missed more than he'd known, Nathaniel walked Rosalind out under a sky gone thick, with stars, the barn glowing warm, and gold behind them. "Good dance," she said. "Good everything," he said. "Lately." She leaned into him, easy, the way she'd grown to do, without either of them remarking on it anymore, and they stood there a while, looking back at the barn that had once burned, and now instead held music, of the man with the canyon-gray eyes who had stopped being someone people were careful around, and started, slowly, being someone they were glad to see coming up the road. Nathaniel Colburn had come to Wyoming Territory with $40 and a horse that died 2 days after he arrived, and the stubborn conviction that the territory owed him nothing, and he owed it everything. He hadn't expected softness, hadn't expected partnership, or the particular peace of loving someone who'd chosen freely to stay. Hadn't expected a friend who'd bleed for him twice, over and call it even. Hadn't expected a valley full of near strangers to ride out into the cold on his behalf, simply because the alternative was letting cruelty keep winning by default. But Josiah Whitfield had known. Somehow, from years back, quiet and unclaimed, he had known. That was the thing about a debt like his. It didn't stay small. It didn't stay simple. It grew, the way good things grow, when nobody's watching too closely, until one letter, folded once and carried up a dirt road by a woman, who thought she had nothing left to offer, turned out to be the start of everything neither of them had known they were missing. "Look after her," Josiah had written. "That is all I ask." He hadn't known the half of what he was asking. Or maybe, Nathaniel thought sometimes, watching Rosalind cross the yard in the last gold light of a long summer evening, maybe he'd known exactly what he was asking all along, and simply trusted the two of them to grow into the rest of it on their own. They had, slow and then all at once, the way seasons always turn. And the valley, watching them, understood something too, that the ground beneath a person's feet only ever stays theirs for, as long as somebody's willing to stand and defend it, together out loud, in a courthouse or a fence line, or a snow-covered yard at midnight. That the quietest debts are often the ones that end up mattering most. and that a promise made to a dying man, carried faithfully across a hard winter, has a way of turning, in the end, into something nobody involved ever thought to call it starting out. A home, family, a love that neither of them had asked for, and both of them, in the end, couldn't imagine living without.